most of us go afield. I'm not the Greffier, I'm the deputy Greffier. The word Greffier is French for clerk, and we're the support, if you like, for the States Assembly. Behind the scenes, we give all the advice and guidance to members. Here in the chamber, we have a role really to make sure everything goes in the right direction. We're not obviously the most important people in here. I'm going to explain.
Oh, yes, you are.
I paid him a fine for that. I'm going to explain really who sits where in the Assembly and also what they do when they're in here, and talk a little bit about the history of the room, and try and squeeze that in. Normally I can go for hours, can't I, talking about it here, but I'll try and condense it down to 25 minutes and let you have an opportunity of being a States member by pressing some of the buttons and making a decision a little bit later on as well. So, welcome to the States Chamber, opened in 1887, the 21st of June 1887 in fact, which was a very special occasion across Great Britain and the Empire, because everyone was celebrating Queen Victoria having been on the throne for 50 years. So it was chosen as a day that we would inaugurate the use of this States Chamber. Up until that time, the States Assembly had shared their accommodation with the Royal Court next door. There's always been a court of some description on this spot in town, and the States would meet within that courtroom, much the same as they do in Guernsey to this day. Their States Chamber is the Royal Court in Guernsey. But we have our own chamber to reflect that separation, to reflect the fact that it's in here that we're making our laws, so we are very separate from the court. Not a lot has changed over the years. The odd lick of paint and obviously the advent of electricity and the electronic voting. What has changed quite a lot is the membership of the Assembly. And I'll just talk through who we've got in here now. Over this side of the Assembly are our senators. This is where the senators normally sit. They were invented in 1948 after the occupation. There was a big shake-up as to who should represent the people of Jersey, and the role of senator was created. And originally they served for a 6-year term of office, so twice as long as the other states members, and they were elected in 2 tranches every 3 years. So the idea was that there would always be 6 members staying in the new Assembly to provide some continuity into the new Assembly. We changed that a few years ago. We've had various attempts to change the composition of the States Assembly over the years, and the poor old senators have been the target of most of those changes. So we've reduced their number down from their original 12 to 8, and their length of office is now the same as everybody else. Everyone serves a 4-year term when they're elected. What we haven't changed, though, is the way that we elect them, because unlike constables and deputies who you can only vote for if you live in a particular parish or district, everyone gets to vote for these guys on an island-wide mandate. So rather than being elected with a few hundred votes, they are more likely elected by thousands of islanders. You might then think they must be the most important members of the states, and I'm sure there are times when that state senators think that they may well be, but actually once they're in here, it doesn't matter how you were elected, how many people elected you, or what really your title is, because every states member is equal. So when they come to press the voting buttons and make decisions on our behalf, no one states member has more power than anybody else. They've all got equal voting rights. So that's our newest members of the Assembly. Our oldest members in terms of history are the connétables, or the constables, who sit in this portion of the Assembly. 12 of them, obviously one for every parish. And we have records of the states going back to the 1500s, in which the constables are part of the original States Assembly. And in fact, that's where we get the name the States from. It's from the 3 estates which formed that original collective that the bailiff would consult with. So we have the people, who were represented by the connétable. We had the church, who were represented by the rectors of each of the parish churches, and then the 12 jurats, who represented the court. So the court, the church, and the people formed the original 3 estates that were the estates of Jersey. We had a big shake-up in 1948 after the occupation, and it was decided that the rectors and jurats who were not elected should no longer be members of the Assembly, and instead we should create the role of senator and boost the number of deputies that we had in order to make it that it was all elected people sitting in this Assembly making decisions island-wide. But the constables are from the original grouping. And back obviously in their parishes, they've got their municipal role within their parish, they're like the mayor of their parish, but they come here to represent the parish interests, not just in parish matters, but obviously island-wide issues too. So that's our connétable. And then the remaining 29 seats are occupied occupied by our parish deputies. Originally, they were invented in the middle of the 1800s, and there was one for every parish and 3 for St Helier to reflect the population difference. As the island's population has expanded, so too the number of deputies has, which is why we've ended up with this odd number of 29. Some parishes like St Helier, which has roughly a third of our population now living in it, about 36,000 people, is divided up into districts and has 10 parish deputies to represent all the folk living in St Helier, whereas some of the more rural parishes, their population has not expanded quite so much, so somewhere like St John or St Mary would still just have the one parish deputy to represent the people there. So depending on where you live in the island, you can vote from anywhere between sort of the 8 senators, your conitart, and 1 deputy. So 10 members of the State's Assembly, through to up to 13, depending on which district you live in across the island. So it's quite a lot compared to the UK, where it's 1 vote for 1 person that you get to elect. So that's one of the differences with our system. So those are our elected members who press the buttons and make the decisions, but there's some other members of the Assembly who, although they can't vote, still play a very important part. You chose a great seat today, madam. That's all right. That's absolutely fine. I'll press it. You're just demonstrating. You're just demonstrating what the dean, who usually sits in this seat, would do. The Dean of Jersey sits in the back row here. Obviously, was part of the original states when the rectors came to be consulted by the bailiff. When we had that shake-up in 1948, we didn't chuck everybody out. We kept the dean as the head of the Anglican Church, as a representative of the church in the Assembly. So he's an ex officio member. He has the right to speak, he has a microphone, and he joins in with debates. He has no right to vote, though. It's rather confusing because we have got voting buttons on here, but that's for when we have the youth assembly in here. The buttons don't work. But he can speak, and he does so. Unlike Westminster, which is a very adversarial setup, you've got one side against the other, the opposition against the government, we're in a horseshoe shape here, and it's designed as a debating chamber. So rather than one side against the other, everybody comes together to debate the issues in front of them. And members can be persuaded to change their mind by the strength of the speeches that are made by their colleagues, including the Dean of Jersey. And you do occasionally hear members saying that they came to a particular debate with a fixed idea of how they might vote, and that they've changed that view because of the speeches that have been made by those within the Assembly, including the Dean. So although he can't vote, he can persuade. And as you would expect, he speaks in debates that are quite emotive, things like abortion, same-sex marriage, things that you would expect a member of the clergy to have an opinion on, but can just as easily join in with stuff to do with the water law or the island plan or anything else that members are debating at the time. He leads us in prayer at the beginning of every state's meeting in French. That's because the languages of the Assembly remain to this day French and English as the official languages, and in fact we've added one into the mix recently with Jerry now being a recognised language of this Assembly. So in theory, members can speak in any one of those 3 languages in here. Thankfully, they stick to good old English most of the time. We have had some issues with our Jerry speaking. The Conotable of St Saviour used some Jerry in one of our debates, and when we came to translate it, we decided in our Hansard to just have Jerry spoken because it was a little bit rude. Jerry being a language predominantly of the farming community.
It's an earthy language, my love.
It's an earthy language, yes. But we are going to try and make efforts to include it on a lot of the paperwork and documents we have going forward so that we are retaining that link with our heritage. So we have some elements of the proceedings where we hark back to our French connections, and I'll flag that up. The Dean reading the prayer at the beginning is one of them. Sitting next to the Dean on the States, they would be the State's legal team, so the Solicitor General, Attorney General, very learned gentlemen. They've got a microphone, they can speak. Unlike the Dean, we wouldn't expect to hear their own personal opinions. They're here just really to give us a legal view. When asked a question about a matter of law, they generally will use an iPad, but all the way along this road, just in case we have a power cut or the internet goes down, demonstrated here by my assistant, we have the laws of Jersey, and that links in with today's special event, because obviously they are laws that have been made by this Assembly over the years. So they're not laws that we've been told to follow by the UK or anywhere else. They're laws that have been specifically written for our little island. And many of them are unique to Jersey. we've got some that are very different from other places. For instance, we decided 10 years ago that Jersey people were sufficiently mature at the age of 16 to be able to vote, whereas in the UK you have to wait till you're the grand old age of 18 to cast your vote. Our tax laws are very different from the UK, hence our fantastically successful finance industry. There are loads of examples where they're very different, loads where they're quite similar, but in every case they have been made in this assembly or by this assembly for Jersey. So they are definitely the laws of Jersey rather than anywhere else. So that's the back row. Over here, where my friend and colleague is sitting, in our seat, is where the Greffiers sit. Our role, but as I said, behind the scenes is to support the assembly. We do all the paperwork for a meeting. Here the first job we perform is to do the roll call. Being a States member is a job. They are expected to come to the assembly whenever there is a meeting, and we meet term time every fortnight on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday if we have completed all of the business. So they're expected to be here, and they need to give us an excuse if they can't turn up. So, when we call the roll call, we do so in French. Monsieur le Sénateur, Madame le Commissaire, Monsieur le Député, and so on. Members answer in French. Présent, if they're a man. Présente, with an E on the end if they're a lady. They also need to give their excuses in French. So if they're perhaps unwell, they would need to contact one of their colleagues who would bob up during the roll call and shout out in French, malade, to let everyone know that that person's too poorly to attend. And we do a little oath just to confirm that and hope that they don't come in later in the day having made a remarkable recovery.
That would never happen.
That would never happen. Never happen. Only a few times. Okay, so they can be malade, they can be marked excuse or excuse. That's generally if they have an appointment, maybe a doctor's appointment or something like that, or that they've got a meeting that they can't possibly get out of, or some event they can't get out of. And members amongst themselves determine whether or not they think that's sufficiently important to have missed the assembly, because really coming to this meeting should take precedence. And the third reason they can miss this meeting is if they are out on the Lille, out of the island, not on a flashy holiday somewhere. They actually have to be working on islanders' behalf. So maybe they're a delegate at a conference representing Jersey, or they're a minister that's gone to meet their counterpart in the UK, something along those lines. And again, members will agree that. If, when their name is called by the Greffier, there is a silence, then they are marked en défaut. They're in default, they should be here, and they are not. Back in the day, we used to actually fine them. I can't remember what it was a very small amount, we did away with that. The shame should be sufficient because it's marked in the minutes, so everyone can see that they were missing at the beginning of the meeting. And if there are any votes that they missed, then the reason for them missing the vote is actually marked as defo, so everyone knows that they have missed. If they should turn up midway through the day and are able then to join us, when they arrive, they can't speak and they can't vote until the assembly marks them as present. So if you ever listen in and watch us, you'll hear members bobbing up and asking to raise the defo on someone. It sounds a bit weird, but what they're asking is to mark them as present so they can join in with the proceedings. And that becomes very important when we think that we do need at least 25 of them in here at any one time. That's our quorum in order for any vote to be valid. So if we haven't got enough people in here, then any of the decisions made won't fly. So we definitely need to have at least 25 people marked on the roll call at the beginning so that we can proceed with our business. How the business works is that absolutely any one of our 49 members are able to put forward items for debate. And they have the same weight and time in the assembly given to them if they're a backbencher or if they're a member of the executive. That's really different from Westminster, where if you're in the government, all your stuff gets priority, and as a backbencher, you really struggle to be able to bring something forward for debate, and more likely it's an aside bit of Westminster Hall, and it's an afternoon, small debate, but no real vote taken on it. In here, States members all have equal rights to bring things forward, so that actually the promises they make on your doorstep, and the knocking on your door, telling you what they're going to do, can actually come to fruition if they've got the drive and the enthusiasm and the charisma to persuade the rest of the assembly to go along with whatever bright idea they have. For instance, several years ago, one of our new deputies had an idea that he wanted to introduce bike helmets for under 18s. So as a backbencher, he brought that as a proposition, the Assembly agreed it, and then the Minister concerned had to go away, get the legislation written, it came back, was debated and became law. So there is a chance for the people telling you stuff on the doorstep to actually be able to push through some of the bright ideas they have if they've got, as I say, the drive, ambition and the charisma, because it is about winning over sufficient numbers of this assembly to vote with you, and you only need one vote in it. So we don't ask for a huge disparity in the voting, it's just one more than everybody else gets something through. We're going to have a go at that now. I, as a backbencher, have written a fantastic proposition. What I do is I suss out what I wanted to ask the Assembly to agree. I produce a little report and then I bring it to the Greffier and his staff, and they help rewrite it and then actually publish it. And everything has to be published for a certain amount of time. We call it being lodged au greffe before it can be debated. For a backbencher proposition, it's 4 weeks. And for something from the government, it needs to be at least 6 weeks, that it's out in the ether for people to read it and decide whether or not they want to support this, perhaps make amendments to it or whatever. On the day, the Greffier will read out the proposition, so everybody knows exactly which thing on the order paper we're up to. And then I, as the proposer, will stand up, I put my light on, I make my speech, and I can speak for as long as I like. Our rules don't limit me. I could go for as long, I could go for days, in fact. I'm not saying anyone does. So a speech can last anything from a couple of minutes to as long as they want, and that goes for all members. It's not just the proposer of a proposition, it's absolutely any member who wishes to speak on that issue. So how it works is, I make my speech, it's a good one. Somebody has to second me, so as long as anybody in the amongst the 49 stands up and says yes, they don't necessarily have to make a speech, they don't even have to vote in favour of my proposition, they're just given the opportunity of it being debated. And then we open it out to the floor, and members indicate using their microphone lights that they want to speak, and the bailiff will call them to join in with the debate. Once everyone's spoken who wants to speak, they can only speak once in each debate. I get the last go, I'm the only one who gets to have a second speech. I get the last hurrah to rally the troops and say vote for my fantastic proposition, which today is that there should be speed bumps on the road outside my house. I live along St Francis Coast Road, it's very busy, it's full of races, there's been quite a few accidents. I've also got a dog that's an escape artist that will get across that road, and one of these days he's going to get flattened by a car trying to get to the beach. So, and also it's not just for my own personal gain. There's a school nearby, the children obviously have to cross the road, and it is dangerous, and there have been 2 very serious accidents along the stretch of road. Make that great speech. So, if you think it is a good idea, you will vote in favour. If you think it's not a good idea, you will vote against. If you're on the fence in the middle, then you will abstain. If you look on your desk, you will see a rectangle containing 3 buttons with PHC. We vote in French here in the Assembly. Back in the day, before we had electronic voting, we used to do what's called an appel nominal, where the Greffier would read out the names of all the members and they would stand up and shout out their vote. We moved to electronic voting to make it more instant, and also because then we have a record instantly of how everybody has voted. So members are given the opportunity to press one of these buttons: P for pour if they're in favour, C for contre if they're against, and A to abstain if they're in the middle. States members don't often press the A button, because obviously then they're sitting on the fence. And if you continually do that, then you're not really making decisions on behalf of islanders. And whether we like the decisions states members make or not, they actually are doing what we've asked them to do, which is make decisions on our behalf. So you expect them to vote for and against on a variety of topics. So, Greffier, if you please, we've got open voting. At the moment, if you try and touch the buttons, nothing happens. In a moment, the magic will start, and you'll see that the buttons will start flashing. Those of you who are sitting in seats that are usually occupied by states members, you have a few seconds to cast your vote. So P, if you think it's a good idea for me to speed bumps. C, if you don't, you like speeding and you don't like dogs. A, if you're not fussed. And you've got a few seconds to change your mind. You'll see that you can swap. If you've accidentally pressed the C button, you can remedy that by pressing the P button now. And I will show you in a minute why I think that's very important if you do so. And then we're going to close the voting. And bailiff, if you would please announce the outcome of the vote if you are able to see what's there. Oh, that's helpful. It's not working. I've just turned it on. You don't need to bailiff. We had 19 in favour, it's a close one, Will, Mellow, and 18 against, and 3 abstentions. So it would have gone through, but just a cautionary tale, I know who you are. We can see how you voted and who's voted in what way. I'll just show you, it's like a quiz all this round. So for every vote, we know exactly who's voted in what particular way. And when it's close like that, as it would be on a real states day, members would probably ask to hear the pros and the cons, and we would read through them so we could tell everyone who voted in what way, because you do sometimes get strange bedfellows. People who are polar opposite politically on some issues can come together and vote on others, because we have that ability to persuade and the mix that we have here in the Assembly. So that is how it works on a voting day. We must talk about the bailiff. I'm so sorry, Al.
It's back on.
Oh, it's back on. It's
But the two of us have voted cons if we lost.
You don't get a vote. Luckily, you don't get a vote. Back in the day, the bailiff did have the casting vote. If we had a situation where it was even Stevens, if it had been 1818, before 2005, the bailiff actually had a casting vote. So what he would normally do by convention was cast in favour or against the proposition, so that whoever was bringing the proposition would actually have to bring it back again in 3 months' time and try and work on getting that extra vote from somebody, rather than him making a decision. But we did away with the bailiff's casting vote in 2005, so I'm afraid you have no vote. And neither do you, as the governor, I'm afraid. Not only do you not have a vote, you don't even have a microphone. Because although you're Her Majesty's representative in the island and a VIP, you get a car with a flag on it, a nice house in St Saviour, and you're the last person to arrive at most big do's. And if the royal family visit Jersey, it's your house they stay at, and you're the conduit for any piece of legislation through to Her Majesty, through to Privy Council for rubber stamping. In here, you're not allowed to speak. You get a microphone when you arrive, from wherever you've come from. As usually it's a military background still, the Governor of Jersey. As Christopher said, next door they noted that it was important to have somebody with military connections, mostly to build fortifications to protect us against invasion from the French. And that situation, although we don't expect invasion from the French, is still the same today, that we have somebody from a military background who is our governor. They serve for 5 years. You have a microphone the first time you arrive to make a speech about how happy you are to be in Jersey, and when you come the next time, it has been taken away. And you have to sit and watch the proceedings for 5 years, taking notes perhaps, to report back to Her Majesty that her island Crown dependency is being run effectively, but you have no voice in this assembly. But when you're coming to leave, when they're revving up the engines of the aeroplane up at the airport, you come in for a special states meeting where it's your chance to say cheerio to everybody, but also make a speech about perhaps the things you've seen and heard during those 5 years in our island. And some of those speeches are quite interesting, as you can imagine. Somebody's had to sit zipped for 5 years. But otherwise you play no part within the proceedings. Whereas our bailiff, our Jersey boy, is our presiding officer, is the chair of the assembly and acts as our speaker and determines the business of the day in terms of being like the referee, if you like. He calls upon people to speak, he ensures members follow the rules, he asks the Greffier to read the propositions and turn on the voting system, and makes rulings if members are stepping out of line or not following the standing orders of the states, and announces the outcome of debates if the gubbins on his desk hasn't been tampered with by the Greffier. And you can see the disparity in height there. Up until the 1600s, it wasn't such an issue. The two roles were very separate. One was kind of looking after protecting the island, one was looking after running the island, effectively administering the island, and also being the Chief Justice. And everything went along swimmingly, but in the 1600s there was a little bit of a tussle between the two who were in both those positions, and a decision was made by the King as to which took priority in here, where the laws were made, and next door, where those laws were interpreted. That in here and next door there should be a disparity in the height of the chairs in order to indicate that it was the local people running their island their own way, with Her Majesty's representative really just watching to ensure that we did nothing crazy.
And the symbology is also, it shows that the bailiff representing the laws, everyone else is below them, so it means that even the monarch is subject to the law.
Absolutely. Just quickly on the mace. The mace is brought into the assembly whenever the bailiff or deputy bailiff are presiding. If for any reason they're not available to do so, then either the Greffier or myself will sit in his chair, and we would not necessarily have the mace unless it was left behind because they've ducked out. because it is the bailiff's mace, and it was given to Jersey in 1663 after the English Civil War. During that time, the island, as a very royalist island, supported the royal family, and after King Charles I was beheaded, his family fled and came to Jersey and stayed in Elizabeth Castle. And the island also, at the point where they heard the news that the king was dead, made a declaration, much as they would do nowadays. The king was dead, long live the king. A copy of that declaration is just in the corner here, that tatty piece of paper. The original is in the archive. It was saying, as far as they're concerned, their new king was King Charles II, but the significance of that was it was signed at a time when really being a supporter of the royal family was likely to get you in prison. And it took 11 years for England to change their mind and decide to restore the monarchy. So Charles never forgot not only that Jersey gave him his family sanctuary, but also showed that loyalty and support. So when he was restored to the throne in 1660, he asked for this beautiful gift to be made and given to the bailiffs in perpetuity. At the bottom there's a small inscription in Latin, basically telling that story, but roughly translated, the first line says, "Not all doth he deem worthy to receive such reward." That's a pop at Guernsey. Just saying. Because they were on the other side of the English Civil War, they were Cromwell's folk, and so when we have a royal visitor, and we can proudly say, since 1204, we have been loyal to the English crown, Guernsey have to sidestep that and say, for many hundreds of years, we have been. And if you want to upset a Guernseyman, you just say, "Where is your mace, sir?" And they have to look away embarrassed. They do not have one. So it goes in the royal court, obviously. It comes out on Liberation Day and any high days and holidays if the royals come, but it's brought in here whenever the bailiff or deputy bailiff are presiding. And I think that's us on time.
Yes.